Okay, for any type of dyeing that we're doing, we're going to need to weigh our fabric or our yarn first. So I have these two skeins that I'm going to be dyeing today. One of them is going to be space dyeing in water, and one of them is going to be more space dyeing on a table with a brush. And both of these yarns are 100% Peruvian Highland wool, so I know that they're probably going to take this dye really well. Again, remembering that acid dyeing is for protein fibers, so wool, silk. But to weigh this, I'm going to go ahead and take off the label. It's going to add just a nominal amount of weight, but we want to get this as accurate as possible. And then we're going to go ahead and turn on our scale, and I know that this is going to be a little too big to fit on there, so I'm going to go ahead and put on my measuring cup. The next things that we're going to need to prepare are additional chokes and then kind of a handle to pull the yarn out from our dye bath. And then for the one that we're painting on the table, it will just be easier to kind of have something to hold rather than trying to grab the yarn that has just been dyed. One, to avoid mixing the dye, and two, just because it could lead to tangles or even breaks if we're not being super careful. So just similar to how we did our chokes whenever we were setting up our work, whenever we're winding our work, I'm just gonna kind of separate this into a few sections. You can see we have one choke here, but as you can imagine, as this gets wet and as we're kind of agitating it, it's gonna become a really chaotic mess if we don't try to add some order to it. So I'm just gonna kind of do this figure 8 choke. So just by swapping the piece that's on the bottom with the one that's on the top. This does not have to be perfect at all. You do not want this to be tight unless you want some sort of like resist. But I think for what we're doing today, we want to keep that really loose so that it can move around, but it's still pretty organized. And I think I'm gonna go for 4 total. So I'm gonna add another one here. Here's that process again. So I'm just kind of like folding it in half and then flip-flopping the choke thread that's on the bottom and the one that's on the top. And then just tying that with an overhand knot. You really just want the fiber that's between those choke divisions to be able to move freely in the water or in the dye that you're painting. And the yarn that I'm using for this is a really thick cotton cord. I would recommend not using wool for this because that tends to be a bit weaker. Using something that under a lot of tension isn't gonna bend at all is what we want. And this is much more important for the space dyeing that's going to be done in the pot, submerged in water. You could probably get away with just 2 chokes for the yarn that you're going to be painting, but I would definitely say that you're going to need more than 1. And then the last step of this is just adding that handle. So just making that pretty loose so that we can slide it around if we need to, and that we have plenty of room to insert our hand to pull it out of the water and to move it around whenever we're washing. So making sure that you have your gloves on, your goggles, your mask. And I'm gonna do this really warm colorway. There are several different types of acid dye in our dye closet, and I really love using Dharma. I use them whenever I can. So I'm gonna use a golden yellow, and then it's an orange, and then this Chinese red. So I'm gonna start with just the smallest, the lightest color. So we're gonna start with this kind of like golden yellow, and the name isn't on there anymore, but someone really graciously put this awesome label on there for us. So I'm gonna very slowly and carefully just add a tiny bit of this to our dye cup. And that is pretty close, so we're gonna set that to the side. That's our golden yellow. You are welcome to label these. And then I have this wet paper towel. It's important that it's wet because all of the dye powder is gonna cling to it. I'm just gonna wipe out my spoon and then check to see if there's any powder on the rim or the jar. Give it a quick wipe if there is. And then take that out of the dye mixing space. So next I'm gonna use this orange. We're going for the same thing. So I'm gonna put my cup on there, tear it out so it's 0. And then the same method. Okay, and then I'm going to take this and throw it away and immediately just put this in the sink so the dye powder doesn't get everywhere, and we're gonna turn our scale off. And then we're gonna add about a cup of water to each one of these, maybe a little bit less because we're working with such a small amount of weft yarn, just so we can easily pour it onto our skein. And then after we add the water, we're just gonna mix it up. And you can see that I've laid out this saran wrap where there's several inches on every side of my skein. I could have done this the long way on the table as well and laid it out flat, but this is just a really experimental one that I'm open to surprises of how the colors are mixing. If you were to lay it out flat, you would probably get just kind of a more regimented gradation of your colors, but I kind of I'm imagining like blending colors here and then kind of having like another color here and one here as well. So I'm already kind of thinking about my design process for how I'm going to be applying the dye once I mix up the dye with water using a spatula. And whenever I pull out my skein from the bath, the vinegar and water bath, I'm twisting it. I want it to be damp but not soaking wet. You can see there's like no extra water on the saran wrap at all. And that's also something that you're welcome to play with in the future if you want this, you know, super watery kind of like diluted dye process. That's something that you're welcome to try. I would just recommend if you're gonna try this with something a little bit wetter than it is right now, to use one of the bins or the trays beneath rather than just doing it on the table. Okay, next is adding the dye onto the skein. And whenever we decided our colors, I just automatically split the total amount, which was 1 gram of dye, into thirds because I wanted an equal amount. If you're doing a more complex calculation, like say for example, you wanted like 1 part yellow and 4 parts green, then you would start with that yellow. You're gonna start with the least pigmented or the least like surface area of your skein. You're also, if you wanted like a really diluted color, like let's say that you were like doing a purple that you wanted like a fifth of the shade as than was normal. So instead of doing, you would do a fifth of a gram instead of a gram of the dye. You would start with your most diluted or your least present dye in your skein. So thinking about my color scheme, which is this golden yellow, orange, and red, I'm gonna start with the yellow, although for this, it doesn't really matter. I could start with my orange as well. And then I'm gonna think about where I want my color. And I'm thinking about my design here too. I think I want the orange in the middle, and I think I want yellow over here and red on this side. So I'm just gonna make sure we can see that part. And for my yellow, I'm gonna start over here and just kind of like work it into the yarn as it's striking. And you can see it's more of like a golden color. I think that's so pretty. I'm also only gonna use about half of this right now. So you can see there's quite a bit left. I wanna make sure that I have enough where if I have any white spots that I can go back over, or if I wanted to flip my skein, I can do that as well. Okay, once I'm pretty happy with the amount of white space and the dye gradation flow on this side, I'm gonna really carefully flip this skein over. For this one, I'm really going for as little white space as possible, which is really possible whenever you're painting on the table. It's less possible whenever you're dyeing in the pot. That actually looks really beautiful. It's kind of striking underneath as well. So I'm just gonna kind of flip my design. So the yellow, the golden color is gonna be over here, and the red is gonna be over here. And I'm gonna continue to work that in. Any white spaces I see that I want filled, that yellow is gonna be really good. I'm also just gonna kind of like check as I'm going. I mean, this looks really, really stunning. I'll put a little over here as well. And I'm just loving this vibrant orange so much, so I'm gonna actually use quite a bit of that just to make sure that that really strikes in the center of my skein. And this is why we have perimeter of saran wrap. Okay, now that our fiber has cooled, we're gonna cut off this plastic wrap. You can see I have a little space set up just to make as little mess as possible. And I'm gonna kind of like try to put it over the pot. I probably could have even done more saran wrap or even a towel underneath. Yeah, there's quite a bit of excess dye in this. I probably should have like squeegeed a bit more of that out with a towel, but let that be your lesson for whenever you're cleaning up, just before you seal off that saran wrap. Squeegee up the excess dye. It was funny because it didn't look like I had that much, but I guess the heat really just kind of brought it out. And I'm gonna cut this away just to make this as little of a headache as possible. And now we can see that there is a lot of the orange. I can see little glimpses of the yellow, but let's rinse it and see what we're working with. When I'm hanging my yarn, I just want to kind of spread it out as much as I can. I don't really want that falling off. Of course, be courteous of space here and do not hang unrinsed fabric or yarn on this rack. Yeah, also I'm hanging mine here, but just be courteous of space whenever we have lots of folks using this, that your project, if you're hanging it on the top, will likely drip onto other folks, which will just kind of create more drying time. So yeah, just be mindful of where you're placing it. And if you know who someone's is and you can tell that it's dry, maybe just let them know so they can remove it from the rack. Okay, and I've filled my pot with lukewarm water. We don't want it to be super hot just yet. And for the space dyeing in the pot, I'm gonna kind of finagle this skein by the handle, and I'm gonna make sure that all of the yarn can be submerged. And I've chosen a wider pot for this rather than a tall one because I want to be able to see as much of my work as possible. All right, now we're going to start the space dyed that will be done in the pot. So with this, typically you do have a bit more white space. It's a bit harder to control. And I'm gonna go for a more pigmented weft than we did with the table painted. So this looks great. I can tell that all of my yarn is submerged. I am going to kind of like just assess how it looks in the pot. Think about, if how it's twisted is how you want it, because naturally when there's a twist, there will be a little bit of resist. And I'm gonna use that same recipe for the acid that we used for the table painted weft. So I'm gonna add about a tablespoon of white distilled vinegar for every 110 grams of dry fiber. And you can just kind of like mix this in. Whenever we put this on the stove and put heat on it, it will naturally mix this up. So you don't have to worry too much about it right now. Unless your yarn is kind of like dividing your pot, then you might want to like add half and half. But we're gonna take this off, or take this out of the sink now and then put it on the stove and apply heat. Okay, I've put on my inner burner and my middle burner, and you can see that I got some heat going. I don't see any bubbles. That's good. We don't want our water to get much higher than 180 with wool, so we don't really want it boiling. If you see bubbles, just reduce the heat, and I have decided to double the saturation of the colors that I'm using. So again, we're using about 100 grams of dry fiber for this weft. So according to kind of the baseline calculation, that would equal about a gram of dye, and I am using 2 different types of dye. So instead of doing a half gram, I'm actually doing a full gram of each one. And that's just to kind of like, one, balance out the water that is going to be kind of unavoidable, that's going to create some dilution in this space dyeing experiment, and 2, just because I wanted a more crisp color than I got in the table painting demo. So I've already measured out my dye powder, put it into my measuring cup, and then added just a little bit of water, just stir that with a spatula, make that into a paste, and then I've added about, I would say like a half a cup of water to that, and then I'm gonna be really gentle with how I'm applying that. This heat is gonna make this dye spread quickly, and I want the dye to come into contact with the fiber rather than the water, because I want to be the one that's in control of how this is hitting the fiber as opposed to the water kind of like spreading it out. So I'm going to be using my brown first, and I have this slotted metal spoon just to kind of like press the dye into the fiber. Again, I know you can't see all of this, but I'm going to make sure to go on the side where you can definitely see it. And I'm just going to kind of like, one, test a little bit just to see how this is striking, and then kind of think about my design as I'm going. So I'm thinking about kind of dividing mine into thirds. So like the top having this blue, and then like the middle having a brown and then a blue as well. So let's see how this strikes. That looks really, really beautiful. I'm just gonna kind of like mix that in. You can see that it's really liking that. And one thing about this type of space dyeing is you can't really see what's going on in the bottom. You can see there is a little bit of brown dye spreading over here, and I can see that there's some white space over here. I want to avoid white space as much as I can, but I know that is inevitable with this type of space dyeing. So I'm just gonna kind of like mix this in a little bit. And then I'm just gonna let this sit. I'm gonna let it sit for about 5 minutes. I'm gonna keep the heat unless I see bubbles, and I'm gonna turn down that heat just a little bit. And you can see this is kind of spreading to the top already, which I think will be really beautiful, especially with this twist that will kind of add this natural resist. I'm kind of going for this like brilliant blue and this kind of like earthy brown balance. So let's see how this looks in a few minutes. I still have a ton of dye left, so that I can add that later if I feel like this is getting too light. Okay, I've moved this camera so you can see a little bit more of what's happening. In just a few minutes, you can see this is spreading quite a bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and add that blue because I don't want all of my weft to be brown. So I'm gonna add this blue in that will hopefully give it kind of this like really pop of intense color. And then I'm gonna let this sit. These are the only 2 colors that I'm using, so I'm gonna let this sit for another 5 minutes. And I'm already pretty confident of how this dye is striking, so I'm gonna kind of just go in with where I know I want that color. And you could choose to just kind of like let this sit if you wanted to. It would kind of create this striping effect. But I know that I want mine to be a bit softer, so I'm just gonna kind of like submerge it ever so slightly so that it really wants to take to that fiber that we can't really see. And I'm gonna add a bit more. Remember, you can always go back and add dye to this. So if you're worried that you're pushing it too far, you can always over dye it later. I'm actually just gonna let that sit. I'm afraid of stirring too much more because I can see that this dye is already spreading quite quickly. I'm gonna leave this because this pot is quite hot. I'm just gonna leave this as it is on this amount of heat for 5 more minutes. And then that's just to kind of like let the dye saturate and soak in. It's been 5 minutes and now I'm gonna turn the heat completely off. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the gas. And then we're gonna just let this sit for 15 minutes. And then we're gonna take this to the sink and wash it. Okay, now that my space dyed weft has completely cooled, I am going to start rinsing it, and I'm probably gonna have to rinse it quite a few times just because of the amount of dye that I added. So again, just a little bit of Centropol or Blue Dawn dish soap. Okay, and you can see that this is a much more brilliant color than the weft that we painted on the table. I'm really, really happy with how this looks, kind of this like dusty brown. And we knew there was gonna be white spaces from the twist and the chokes. I probably could have done that a little bit looser, but honestly, getting some white space with the space dyed in the pot is kind of just the nature of it, and I really love this kind of watery section here. So I'm gonna give this one more rinse because I can still see some suds, and then I'm gonna hang it up to dry.